Mm-hmm.
I do like that phrase there. Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath.
Yep.
Yeah, remember this, and it's given as a gift, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is important to remember. It's not it is a command, but it's not just a well, here's some extra thing you have to do or you're not allowed to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's hey, it's like remember this day of rest that I gave you. You don't have to work. It's like a dad walking into the
Yeah.
room and the kids are all doing homework or chores, and he's like, hey, remember to play on that Xbox I bought you.
Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy,
And I'm Caleb.
and you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we are continuing our series on the Ten Commandments, and this episode, we're going to talk about what we're calling the fourth commandment, and that is remember the Sabbath day. Now, this may be the most ignored of all the Ten Commandments. There are others that aren't followed as much, like, say, adultery and other things that we wish were followed more, but don't commit adultery. But in the Ten Commandments, though, the Sabbath just seems to get overlooked. It's skipped right over.
Yeah, people at least kind of complain about it when
Yeah.
they see people breaking the other commands.
Yes, right. Yeah, but they talk about them all the time, but the Sabbath, not many people talk about it at all. Now, even though it starts with the word remember, that's kind of funny, it's been forgotten.
Mm.
So let's begin by reading it in the NIV. Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So this is interesting, I think, because the Sabbath, the term, the Sabbath, the proper noun, isn't in the Bible until Exodus 16, where it talks about the manna. And then we get here to the Ten Commandments, and it's very prominently displayed as one of the Ten Commandments, which is a monumental thing. Like, if I was a commandment, I'd want to be one of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
But it hasn't even really been mentioned hardly at all. So, why isn't there some passage in the patriarchs say that says like Abraham rested because it was the Sabbath or something like that? You just don't even hear about it. All of a sudden, here it is in the Ten Commandments. So,
Yeah, that's true. Now, it does appear as well in Deuteronomy 5, where the commandments are given again. And it's interesting that there's slightly different context in the way that it's given, because God says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day.
yeah.
And
Well,
that,
he had to add the context because here they were living that. Like they had
Right.
just been brought across the Red Sea and they go a few miles and it's
Right.
like, we're hungry. And they
So-
start complaining.
yeah. So then the manna comes, and then the Ten
Mhm.
Commandments come. So when you're a slave, you don't get to take a day off unless your master's okay with it. So
Yeah.
they were not really able to observe the Sabbath, whether or not they had a concept for it
Yeah.
in Egypt.
Well, look how highly developed it is. Even by the time you get to Exodus 20 in the first giving, it's
Mhm.
like, you can't do the work. Your kids can't do the work. Your servants can't do the work. If there's a
Your
foreigner,
animals.
you can't do the work. An
Yeah.
animal can't. It's like everything is pretty highly developed by this time. So it's odd that it's never even like mentioned before this,
Yeah.
So
Now,
interesting.
So in Deuteronomy 5, it gives the reason as being brought out of slavery. In the Exodus giving of the Ten Commandments, though, the reason it goes back to creation.
Yeah.
So why
Yeah.
don't we go ahead and read that?
Yeah. Okay. Because since you're our historian, I always like to say, why don't
Yeah,
you give
you
us
forgot to bring it up.
Why don't you give us a tour of biblical literacy here on what was happening to build up to this moment?
Right. So although the term Sabbath doesn't show up until Exodus 16. The concept is in the second chapter of the Bible, in Genesis 2. So this is Genesis 2, 2 through 3. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So the creation itself only takes 6 days, right? As we would reckon it, Sunday through Friday. And rather than just say, well, that's it, 6 days, and then that's how we form our week, God adds deliberately a seventh day of rest,
Yeah.
and he blesses it and calls it holy.
Yeah, it's interesting because he on the seventh day he rests, like you said, and he blesses it. And so we need to look into what this word rested means, because God does that on the seventh day, and it's the reason he blesses that day.
Mhm.
And so when we get into looking at the Hebrew word, we find out that the word is Shabbat, which is the same as the word for
The
Sabbath.
Sabbath, yeah.
But it's not the formal name of it. It just says he rested, at that time. And so, why would he bless the day on which he rested? It seems like wouldn't you bless the other 6 days when you were doing all the stuff?
Mhm.
But it's because it's a rest of satisfaction, right? It's a rest of completion. He's that word Sabbath, means completed. It means rested,
Mhm.
and so on, and a celebration. And so basically, he's resting because he's satisfied with what he's completed. He's very pleased with his creation, like he had said in the verses immediately preceding this at the end of chapter 1.
Yeah, that's why throughout the Bible you'll see the number 7 come up symbolically sometimes. It's the number of completion, the number of perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And 6, by contrast, is seen as a bad number because
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like it's deliberately stopping short of that perfect 7.
Yeah, because actually, keeping Sabbath, or honoring Sabbath, remembering the Sabbath, celebrating the Sabbath is doing something.
Yeah.
As it's not as though God didn't do anything on that seventh day. That seventh day was a part of the creation. That was a part. It was not only his reveling in his creation and his satisfaction with it, but it was for us to know God's satisfied with me. Like he's happy he made us.
Yeah, we're part of the creation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so the whole world, the whole universe, partakes in the joy of God in celebrating His creation. So there's more to it in that than just like, oh, he was tired, so he rested. That's not that's not what it's
Yeah.
trying to say.
So what is he doing exactly when he blesses the day, when he makes it holy?
Yeah, so it's like I don't know exactly how God blesses something, but if you think of the word, I think is barak in Hebrew, and it means to adore something or to bow to something. And so if you think about it in that way, God's satisfied, with his creation, so he's bowing to it, saying, that I'm happy with you. And
It's worthwhile.
yeah, it reminds me of like I guess the best modern analogy I can think of it is when Hideki Matsuyama won the Masters a few years ago. His caddy, the caddy always takes the flag off the 18th
Mhm.
uh, flag and gives it to the golfer.
Trophy.
Yeah, off of the flag stick, and he was putting the flag stick back in, and he turned to the course and bowed to it, and it was kind of like, thank you for being the most awesome golf course in the world, and that we just beat you.
Yeah.
We won, because it's just like God's creation. It's the greatest thing ever. Like God's like, oh, I just made the greatest thing anyone's ever going to make. And I think that's kind of like what Hideki Matsuyama's caddy was thinking. Like, this is like, I'm at the top. Like,
Yeah.
we just beat the Masters. And so he
Yeah,
bows
it's
to the
interesting.
course.
It's like humility. It's like your only
Mhm.
reaction to this total like overcoming that you've just done is actually humility.
Yeah, it's probably the greatest reaction to winning the pinnacle of sports I've ever seen, because most of the time people are like
Fist
guzzling
pumping.
champagne out of the trophy, and all that
Well,
stuff.
he probably did that off camera.
Which is totally appropriate. You're celebrating, you're having it. But this was just like it was totally amazing, and everyone was like stunned, right? Like when you're watching it live, they were like, "What did we just see?" Like they started playing it immediately, playing the replay of it,
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of captures the kind of, like you said, the humility of the awesomeness of the moment. That
Mhm.
like even God, who created it all, was like, "Man,
Kind of humbled by what he had done
this
in a way.
this is really
Yeah.
what I wanted. This is just what I wanted."
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great thing to keep in your mind about the completion, the satisfaction of Sabbath, because that's, I think, the mindset we're supposed to have when we say, why am I able to take a day off? Right? Like
Mhm.
it's because I have a God who's incredibly awesome. I can trust. He's providing for me. I don't have to go out and kill myself all 7 days of the week, just 6.
Yeah. So we're kind of resting with God and in God when we do that. I mean, if God didn't, if God took that day to rest, right, and to be satisfied with creation, we can surely afford to do it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So, like the word Sabbath is used here. It's not the formal version of, like we would capitalize, and it doesn't
Yeah.
show up in our Bibles as the capitalized word Sabbath, but it's like
It's there as like a verb, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
He rested. So it couldn't be done that way unless you, turned it into a verb, and, we could use it that way, but we don't typically. Um, but anyway, yeah, so in a way, Sabbath is the final work of God. Like after he proclaims everything to be very good, he says, "And here's the crown, a Sabbath." It's
Mhm.
it because it is a work. I mean, it is something, because you have to recognize it. If you have to establish it, you have to
Yeah, that's
participate in
true.
it.
Each day has its thing, its list of things that he made, like the
Yeah,
light and separating light and the darkness and all down through each day. On the seventh day, he made a holy day.
because there's some.
He invented rest.
Yeah. Well, also there's something wrong with a created thing that doesn't revel in its creator.
Hmm.
And that's what's wrong with our society, right? That's why we're saying, hey, let's get back to the 10 Commandments, you and I. Let's study the 10 Commandments. How could they solve all of our society's problems? And one of them would be, hey, solve this problem of why doesn't everybody revel in our amazing creator God?
Yeah.
I mean, look what he's done. And man, we're so, you know, we're so lost because we don't recognize who gave all this to us. We don't honor him. We don't adore him. We
Yeah.
don't bow to him.
But then after this, there's nothing. There's nothing from Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It
No,
just doesn't come up.
no, it's very strange. It's very strange.
But the way that it's brought in to context there with the Hebrews in Exodus, it
Mhm.
does feel like it's maybe a notion that already
Yeah,
exists in their consciousness.
it does. Yeah.
But they probably couldn't, like we said, couldn't have practiced it in Egypt because
Mhm.
there's somebody forcing them to do whatever he wants them to do.
Well, as strange as its complete absence is between Genesis 2 and Exodus 16, even stranger is the initial story of Sabbath practice that
Yeah.
comes up. And so we're going to look at Exodus 16, try to cover it as quickly as we can. But in Exodus 16, verses 1 through 5, it says, "The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. On the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt." So this is not very far, like out of Egypt,
2
right?
weeks, yeah.
Well,
Or the second month, sorry.
yeah. So a few weeks.
2.5 months.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, something like that. In the desert, verse 2, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So, like, that's the instruction after nothing since Genesis 2 about the seventh day. Then all of a sudden, just go you'll get twice as much on the sixth day.
Hmm.
And that's all he says, no reason or anything. So it's kind of odd. So then, if you jump down to verse 21 in chapter 16, it says,
Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. So that's kind of implying that they were a little bit surprised.
yeah.
Because they're coming to give him, hey, well, look what happened. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it till morning." So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any."
So verse 23 of chapter 16 is the first time that the formal word Sabbath, the Sabbath, appears in the Bible. And even here, it's tied more to God's activity than it is to the people's activity.
He's resting from getting the manna, yeah.
Yeah, he's putting out double on the 6th, and then on the 7th, he doesn't do any in homage to his creation. Similar to what happened in Genesis. So it's tied to God's activity so far, but the people didn't want to be let out of this, because just like God had predicted, they didn't want to listen to him. He said, "I'm going to test them to see if they'll listen to me."
Who could have seen that coming?
So then in Exodus 16, verses 27 through 30, it says, "Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out.' So the people rested on the 7th day." So they had to have their share of the Sabbath,
Yeah. They had to learn it the hard way.
Mm-hmm.
I do like that phrase there. Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath.
Yep.
Yeah. Remember this. And it's given as a gift, which I think is important to remember. It is a command, but it's not just a, well, here's some extra thing you have to do or you're not allowed to do. It's, hey, it's like, remember this day of rest that I gave you. You don't have to work. It's like a dad walking into the room and the kids are all doing homework or chores. And he's like, hey, remember to play on that Xbox I bought you.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and we also have a possible tie back here to Exodus 5:5, which says, "But the king of Egypt said, 'Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work.' Then Pharaoh said, 'Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working,'" which is the same verb there of resting. They're resting from their work. And so Pharaoh is saying, "You can't rest," And so here God's like, "Oh yeah, you can.
Yeah.
You're not under Pharaoh anymore."
Like we pointed out in the Deuteronomy 5 giving of the commandments, this is the reason God gives. "I brought you out of slavery, out of Egypt. Therefore, observe the Sabbath." You're not slaves. Take a day off.
Yeah, it's a gift. I mean, and of course, we'll see later. Jesus talks about it that way too. So from the very beginning of the practice, it was for the people, right? However, it quickly developed into a stronger prohibition, just like we talked about in earlier with chapter 20, where we saw, that it had to enumerate like, it can't be your animals. And it can't be your servants. It's like the people were probably like, "Oh, I know a way around this,"
Yeah.
And then
I won't do anything. I'll just kind of, nudge the donkey in the right direction.
Yeah. So that is an escalation, of the prohibitions. And then when you get to Exodus 31, verses 12 through 17.
"Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Observe the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it is to be put to death. Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from their people. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed.
So now it's a capital offense
Yeah.
to violate the Sabbath, to desecrate the Sabbath, whatever that
To
would
work
mean.
on it.
Yeah, to work on it too. Yeah, it expounds it.
Yeah, you could desecrate it in ways, I guess, that are not working,
Not to acknowledge that,
Yeah.
that God is basically, desecrating the Sabbath.
But it's, again, he stresses that it's a gift, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, like he's saying this is a sign. This is a sign between me and you. He says that twice.
Mhm.
It's like the same thing with circumcision or with the ritual law. Like it sets Israel apart from the other nations.
Yeah.
Goes back to that conversation we've talked about several times between Moses and God, where Moses is begging, you have to go into the land with us, or else there's nothing to distinguish us from the other people.
Yeah, I mean, in that Genesis 2 passage, it talked about how he sanctified it or made it holy, right? Set it apart, like the Sabbath day set apart, just like the people are set apart.
Mhm.
Yeah, so perfect. Now, at the very end of this, it says, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And speaking of God, and that word refreshed there means like to breathe, like to breathe out, I guess like, kind of like, like a satisfaction,
Mhm.
breath. So it's the same kind of idea, it's like, I'm resting, I'm satisfied, you sit down and let that air out, And so, so yes, even in this passage where it's talking about, the capital punishment, it's also talking about it in the context of, hey, you're supposed to just be satisfied, like Caleb was talking about. Go play your Xbox. What's wrong with you? That's funny. But in this case, yeah, it's like, God, look at what God's given you. Like we've called people to do in the past. It's like the world that he's given us is so amazing that you couldn't spend your whole life. You could never visit all the places
Yeah.
God's created. You couldn't meet all the people he's put you here with to enjoy it with. And so, but we sit in our houses and go, I'm bored. I don't know what to do.
G.K. Chesterton said the chief sin is boredom.
Yeah. It's
He's
probably
sitting there
true.
like, there's nothing to do. Like, in other words, creation isn't good. God was wrong.
Yeah.
This is not delightful.
This is the opposite of that, right? This is like revel in the creation,
Yeah.
and recognize how great it is, and set aside time. It's an effort. There's an effort to it, We just think of it as, I'm just not going to do anything because it's Sabbath. So silly. So we saw this in our study of the prophets, right?
Mhm.
It wasn't just
the violations of it.
yeah, and that was what led to the people losing the land, is partly the Sabbath observance being forgotten, and but it wasn't just for the people, right? Because I think it's all the creation. I think one of your favorite passages that captures that is in Second Chronicles. If you want to read that,
Yeah, 2 Chronicles 36:20 through 21. He carried in exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah.
yeah. So this actually comes from Leviticus 26, which talks about this kind of in a prophetic way. Way back there, that you're going to lose the land. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's going to be because, of all your failures, but, and the land's going to enjoy its Sabbaths while you're out of it. So, but this was Jeremiah too, talked about here, talking about how you're not observing the Sabbaths, you're going to lose the land and you'll be gone for 70
Yeah,
years.
but they were commanded to give land a rest every seventh year.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
And
Which, like we know now, it even has a practical application, but it's still rooted in the Sabbath year, because you have crop rotation and you let a field fallow, for a year to replenish the nutrients in it, and they're not doing that, and they're not respecting the land, the creation, or the God that made it. And he's like, you know what? I feel bad for the land, so I'm going to give it a break from you.
yeah. because it's part of his created order, and all of the created order is supposed to enjoy the Sabbath, not just us. And so the people weren't allowing the created order to breathe, like we talked about with God. It's like that satisfaction, that breath, on the Sabbaths or on the Jubilees or any of those things. So yeah, it's a very, there's a lot of passages you can go back and look at about this. We don't have time to cover them all, but we want to jump to the New Testament and start talking about how Jesus also had a history of the Sabbath, with the Sabbath. And one of the most interesting of those is in Matthew 12, verses 1 through 14. So let me read that. It says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath.' He answered, 'Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus.
Yeah. So you can see the competing views of the Sabbath held by Jesus and the Pharisees here.
Yeah. Yeah, because Jesus is actually trying to redeem the Sabbath, right?
Yeah.
He's doing good on the Sabbath. He's reveling in God's creation like we've been talking about, because it always had been a gift to man. And Jesus saw it that way. Like, there's a parallel passage in Mark. Was it at Mark 2?
Yeah, Mark 2 has the same story, it seems like, because almost all the details are the same, but there is an extra phrase that Mark comments on where Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man. That goes back to what in those Old Testament passages we were seeing how this is a gift to man. It's not just like a harsh law. It's a gift.
And not man for the Sabbath, he says too. So it's kind of like the thing. It's not supposed to be onerous, and it's supposed to be a great blessing, like playing the Xbox.
Yeah, man wasn't made just to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made to bless and strengthen man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting. I mean, think back on like the curse, right, in the garden after the fall, right? God tells Adam, "By the sweat of your brow you'll eat." But then we still get this extra day of rest,
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Well, and so you see Jesus on the Sabbath, he's trying to bless people just like God blessed the day. And the Pharisees are trying to use the capital punishment clause of the Sabbath laws, right, to kill Jesus. As it gets to the end of that, and it says they went out and plotted how they might kill him, probably thinking, hey, he violated the Sabbath. We can get him for that.
Yeah.
And so, ironically, that would be killing an innocent man, which would be desecrating the Sabbath day by violating one of the other 10 commandments that we'll get to in a couple weeks.
But kind of the biggest statement here, the biggest verse of that passage is the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah. Yes.
Which that right there is clearly a claim to deity. There's no way around that.
It is. And you can compare that with Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 3, that say, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. And it's amazing. Like you think about, well, if Jesus was the agent of creation, then he was participating with God in that rest. Like
Yeah.
it got, but the Father's been, saying, hey, let's do this, let's do that. And the Son's been the one who's been the agent of all that
hmm
work. And then it's like he sits down, but then he also has to sustain everything
Yeah.
in perpetuity forever, in however long this creation lasts. It doesn't last without his sustaining power.
Yeah. So he can look at the Pharisees and be like, "Oh, you want me to take a day off?" Okay. And then everybody collapses into, an eternal abyss.
Yeah. Um, so, if he stops, everything stops. And that's an amazing thing. And then not only that, in this passage, it talks about, well, then also, hey, we needed purification for sins. So he took care of that too.
hmm
And then he sat down. It's kind of like maybe that's the blessing for creation, right? Was this purification for sins. And
hmm
then he could sit down satisfied saying, hey, I can rest now, from this work. So interesting.
Yeah. I also wanted to bring up here a similar story in Luke in chapter 13.
Okay.
There's another Sabbath healing, right? Which is, such a terrible crime in the eyes of the Pharisees. So this is Luke 13:10-17. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. So there's that delight. Another
Hmm.
thing, we won't read it, but another passage I had looked at for this was Isaiah 58:13-14. It talks about finding joy in the Lord by keeping the Sabbath, by delighting in it.
Yeah.
And it's, the Pharisees are, you can come and get healed on a Tuesday. That would, like, what do they do? So if a doctor is like, if a woman's in labor or like somebody's, deathly ill, they're just like, yeah, you just gotta wait till tomorrow, I guess. You can't do your job. What? How do they apply it? It doesn't make any sense. But I wanted to bring this passage up. You were talking about that purification of sins, right? That was a part of this gift, right? And here Jesus points out this woman's been bound by Satan. She should be
Hmm.
set free on the Sabbath from what bound her. And he tells her, "Woman, you're free from your infirmity." There's a deeper meaning to that than just her physical ailment, because as we're saying, as that Hebrews verse pointed out, Jesus is going to free us from our spiritual ailments as well. We
Yeah.
looked at in Egypt in the Old Testament there how God says, "I brought you out of slavery from Egypt." That's part of the reason why you are to observe the Sabbath. That's when you're brought out of bondage. And we
Hmm.
know that the Passover is an image, a foreshadowing of the crucifixion. That's our Passover. We're brought out of, Paul talks about this extensively. We're brought out of slavery to sin. We're
Hmm.
brought out of that bondage to the devil here, like Jesus is pointing out about this woman. And like the devil, he's not just worried about her. Well, she just shouldn't be able to walk. He's more, there's more of an attack going on than that. So, so that's the bondage that we're ultimately brought out of. And then we can rejoice in that and rest in it and worship the God who did it for us on the Sabbath.
Yeah, because everything God created is great, including his law. And so, when and the fact that the people recognized what Jesus was doing was a
hmm
blessing is showing how God's creation revels in seeing the proper observance of the Sabbath, which is to do good for somebody.
hmm
And so when you look at what was happening in the context of the original story we read in Matthew 12 with the picking of the heads of grain, it's interesting. It's like you say, well, but I thought, the manna law is pretty clear. Like, don't go out and gather food on the Sabbath. So
Mhm.
that sounds like they have to be
Yeah.
violating the
Yeah, it
Sabbath,
does
right?
sound like a contradiction there.
Yeah. But if you look at passages like Leviticus 19:9, which says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God."
Yeah.
Now,
We
you say,
see some of those that law come up a couple times later in the scripture. We'll see people leaving for the poor. Was Boaz and Ruth is a great example.
yes.
He even tells people, throw some on the ground for her to find.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so you see that God's law was providing food for the poor and travelers.
Mhm.
And so that's a great feature of the law, like
That's what
that it
God was
provides.
doing in the desert with the manna. All right, they're literal slaves who have now run out into a desert.
Yes.
It's like the worst possible situation you
Yeah.
could be in, and He's providing food for them in the desert. He gave them a double portion
Hmm.
on the sixth day. Remember, and then they they gathered that, and then they had it left over for the seventh. Jesus appeals to the example of David when he's arguing with the Pharisees. David and his men were on the run and they had no food, came to the temple and ate the consecrated bread.
Hmm.
Which, if you just waltzed in there, if you're just a normal guy in a normal situation, and you just go in and eat that food. That's You're desecrating it. But God is not commanding them to die of starvation,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
It's different when you're in an extreme circumstance. There, you're allowed to feed yourself because guess what? You're part of His creation, which He called good and blessed, and the bread or whatever you're eating is part of His creation, which He blessed.
mhm.
So you're not sinning in that regard, unless if it's just gluttony, if it's greed or something, that would be different.
Well, it would be tempting to compare the picking of the heads of grain to the original giving of the Sabbath ordinance in the manna story, um, until you realize that the manna wasn't even there on the Sabbath. So, like,
Yeah,
God didn't provide manna on the Sabbath. It would have been impossible to violate the Sabbath in that regard because there was nothing there to pick up.
they went out and looked for it,
Yeah,
and
it was the fact that they went looking for it.
yeah,
But then they're supposed to be eating pre-prepared food on the Sabbath, and that's all that they were really doing in the field. That someone else had prepared that food by following the law in Leviticus
yeah, and they
19:9.
were just nibbling on the grains. They didn't cook,
They didn't
knead it
cook
or
the
cook it or
food. Yeah.
anything. Yeah,
So you see, they really aren't violating the law because
and they were
they're
travelers.
yeah, they're not
Jesus and
picking
they're
their
wandering
own
around
grain. They're not doing a job. They're saying, "Look, someone prepared this food for us to
on the
eat."
edge. They're on the edge of the field.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so we are eating it. And so, yeah. So here's the interesting thing, though. The Pharisees, it says, were watching them, and when they did it, they said, "Aha! What are you doing?" It's sort of like, well, what are you guys doing? Like, it's the Sabbath, and there's visitors in your town. Why haven't you invited them into your house for a Sabbath
yeah, yeah,
meal? Or why aren't you providing food for them? You got a sojourner right here.
yeah.
You can do that yourself, right?
Isn't spying a job? Seems like you're working pretty hard there.
Yeah. So who was better following the law? Jesus, who said, "Oh, look, the Lord has provided through Leviticus 19 what we need today to eat,
Hmm.
pre-prepared food waiting for us," right? Or is he better following the law, or is the person who's spying on them and not inviting them to their house to have a meal when they
Yeah.
see that they're traveling and hungry?
Yeah,
So
like,
it's
leave them alone to starve, and then when they feed themselves, I gotcha.
yeah. So it's a very peculiar situation when you think about it properly in the context of the whole law. It's Jesus who's honoring the Sabbath, not the Pharisees.
Mhm.
And he's the one reveling in the completion of God's work, a completion of his law, the completion of his created order, and that people are taking care of people by providing that food there. And then the Pharisees are there fully capable of providing for people, and they aren't doing it. So, okay, so we're going to look at Jesus and his rest. So we'll start with Matthew 11:28 through 30.
Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Yes, I
And that
think, oh, go ahead.
that's kind of getting back to that gift we were talking about, right? Like, this is a gift for you. And it's certainly tempting, especially in our modern, capitalist consumerist culture. Like we just got to go, 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 work, 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 spend, spend, spend the money.
Mhm.
And we just, I remember, we've almost always had fish tanks around when I was
Mhm.
growing up, and we have one in our house. And I used to work at an aquarium store, so I was kind of big into aquariums. And there was this YouTube channel I was watching by this guy who owns a shop, and he was giving advice on people who want to or considering opening a shop or have one. And he was saying you have to be open on Sundays. That's just the reality. You're not going to be profitable. If you need to close one day a week, do it in the middle of the week or something.
Mhm.
And and I was just like, that's the mindset. That's our mindset. You know.
Yeah.
Never mind the fact that the most profitable, like per unit, per location, the most profitable fast food restaurants are Chick-fil-A's. And if you
Yeah.
take one location to one other location, on average, they're way more profitable than McDonald's or Burger King or any of the other other ones.
Well, if you think about it, if every single restaurant was closed on Sunday, what would happen? What would have to happen
You'd have to eat your food at home.
with your family?
Yeah,
Yeah, which is the whole concept of the Shabbat, meal with
yeah.
that the Jews do. So it would be, self-fulfilling right there. So, but getting back to this passage here, how do you get in a situation where you need to be unburdened by your weariness, that you're struggling through life with? Is only if you've already forgotten the Sabbath, right?
Mhm.
If you've already forgotten the God of creation who created you and everything around you, and you are reveling in it and enjoying it and participating in it, you wouldn't be in this burdenful situation because you would already be, aware of your need for Christ. You'd already, um, be following God's law. You'd already be following the Sabbath. You'd
Yeah.
already be at rest in
Well,
that
I
sense.
think we mentioned earlier the command starts with the word remember, because the real
Hmm.
temptation we have is just to forget it.
Yeah. What are you supposed to remember? Like what?
I can't
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah. What would you? I mean, we've talked about the Sabbath in the context of Genesis 2, Exodus 16, Exodus 20, Exodus 31. Um, and we didn't mention on Exodus 31 that was in the context of building the tabernacle, and
Yeah.
that God was giving that capital punishment prohibition to say, look, don't even work on my tabernacle, um, you know, on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
But anyway. So, but what is it you're supposed to remember when you remember the Sabbath? Are you supposed to remember like that God created everything, right? That's what
Mhm.
Genesis 2 was all about. You're supposed to remember that God likes what He created, including you.
Mhm.
That's a good thing, and that God provides for what He has created. That's why we don't have to work because
So what we
God's
saw in Exodus 16 with the manna, in Leviticus 19 with the edges of the fields,
yeah,
leave it
yeah,
there for travelers.
yeah. See, God is our provision. You got to remember that. So you remember to be as satisfied with God's creation as He is,
Mhm.
like as He is in Genesis chapter 2. He designed everything, including us, to enjoy His rest. That's why the land enjoyed its rest when the people were finally out of it because they weren't practicing the Sabbath and everything was out of whack. And so it's like a total satisfaction with God's work is what Sabbath is about.
Mhm. Yeah. So speaking of total satisfaction,
Yeah.
we'll read this kind of a long passage, but we want to kind of put it in its context. So this is John 19:16 through 30. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out of the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him two others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's decide by a lot who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, they divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that the scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
So this is the completion of Jesus Christ's work of ministry in the flesh, on earth. And when he gets done, he says, "It is finished.
Yeah,
It is complete," right? It is time to rest.
right. And he gives up his spirit, which we've pointed out a lot that the
Mhm.
word spirit in these ancient languages is going to be the same word as breath, right?
Yes.
So he's and in some of the other crucifixion accounts, it'll say that he commended his spirit to God. So he
hmm
gives back to God what God has given him, right?
Yeah. And Jesus is completely satisfied with his work, just like God was completely satisfied with his work in Genesis 2. So it's the same concept as God's creative work and Jesus' salvific work. And you see here that we're at the end or at the end of his life. He dies on on a Friday
On the sixth day.
on the sixth day, and he completes his work on the sixth day,
Hmm.
and then he takes his satisfied rest there when he bows his head,
Hmm.
and then he's in the tomb
On the
on
Sabbath.
on the Sabbath at rest,
Yeah.
satisfied with what he's accomplished. And then you get to Sunday, and he rises
Yeah.
and ushers in a whole new creation in a sense.
Yes. And so that brings us to why Christians celebrate the Sabbath on the first day and not the seventh. I mean, in the creation account, God rests on the seventh. Throughout all the Old Testament, and then even to today, Judaism observes it on the seventh day. So why do Christians do it on the first? And this is why. Because our salvation is effected on the sixth day. That's when Jesus says it is finished. That's when he makes satisfaction for sin, and it's completed. And then he rests, like you said, in the grave on the seventh day, and then rises on the first day. And actually, you get this concept of the eighth day. You'll see this in a lot of early church writings, like patristic sources, early church fathers. They'll talk about Easter Sunday as the eighth day, and it's like the first day of the new creation. Jesus says, "I'm making all things new," and that's where we get that concept of that's the Lord's day. And so this is
Mhm.
the day that we're going to observe it. And I wanted to bring up because all those things we talked about in the Old Testament there with being brought out of slavery to Egypt, or with that woman that was healed who was bound by Satan, and we were under slavery to sin. That's all been that's all been pointing towards this satisfaction, this completion of Jesus on the cross. So let's look at Colossians 2:16 and 17, where Paul says, and actually, let's back up a little bit to verse 13. When you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. So that's all been pointing towards this reality, towards the
Mhm.
reality of Christ. And you do have Christian groups that still insist on celebrating on the seventh day of the week. But Paul is saying there, don't let anyone condemn you based on that. I mean, we do need to observe a Sabbath, a rest. But as far as which day of the week, uh, and there's another passage as well in Romans 14 where Paul says something very similar. That one day, one man counts one day holy, and another counts a different day. But that's not the primary issue. The primary issue is that Christ is the reality. So as long as that's what we're looking at, then seventh day, first day, both kind of apply.
Hmm.
But the early Christians chose the first day partially to distinguish themselves from the Jews, and also as this idea developed of the eighth day of creation. This is what everything is working towards.
There's also a concept of a Christian rest,
Mm.
which gets away from these cycles of 7 days and just to a future rest for Christians.
Mhm.
And you see some of that in like Revelation 14, a final rest for those who are saved. Revelation 14, 6 through 13 says, "Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, 'Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water.'" Now, see, if you remember the Sabbath, you'd be already doing that, honoring the one who made all that. A second angel followed and said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and its image and receives its mark on their forehead and on their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, or for anyone who receives the mark of its name. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus." Then I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write this: Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." So it's pretty interesting. There's no rest for wicked people,
Yeah.
but there's a rest for those who die in the Lord. So.
Yeah. Yeah, we still have that proverb, no rest for the wicked. Right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and I mean, again, that's we've been stressing this constantly that the Sabbath, the rest, is a gift.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
a gift from God, and this is a harsh passage. I mean, eternal torment right there.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting that first angel that comes, he gives everybody like, "Oh, here's your chance. Fear God
Hmm.
and honor the one who made everything." And then there's the people who go, "No thanks."
And it talks about the beast, right? Drinking the cup of the beast and the mark of
Hmm.
the beast. We mentioned earlier the numbers of 7 and 6, 7 being completion, 6 being incomplete. That's why that's the number of the beast.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Never
because
make it to the rest.
yeah, you never get there. You always before you take the day of rest, you always start back at the beginning and keep working and working.
Yeah,
And
maybe.
that's an interesting point, I think, in terms of our salvation. Like we're not working for our salvation. Like we're not earning it. I can't make myself holy. I can't do enough good deeds.
I've been telling you that
I'm
your whole life.
entirely yeah. Well, it actually applies to the rest of you too, believe it or not. Like we're entirely reliant on Christ and His work on the cross. That's why that's that central point that everything was pointing to, and that's where you find rest. That's why His yoke is easy and His burden is light. It's not that we are not still supposed to follow the law because we
Hmm.
are because it's good and perfect. It's just that it's not my upholding of that, like how much of it I do or how perfect I do it. It's how perfect Christ did it.
Well, it gets back to the same thing God said in Exodus 16 about, well, I'll tell the people this just to show you. I'll test them. Don't go out and pick anything up on the
Yeah,
seventh day, and they go out and
and we
try
still try to.
anyway.
Yes, I mean
Yeah,
that's legalism.
and so that's the whole concept you're talking about. There is people not being satisfied with God's law, not saying, "Ah, what a great thing that He's given me,"
Hmm.
and
Or with
instead saying,
His mercy.
how could I change this to make more sense than this
Yeah,
silly law He's given me?
yeah, or with His
It's-
mercy either. We're not satisfied with that. We want to try to earn it ourselves.
yeah, yeah, that's true. So this fourth commandment is all about being satisfied with God. It's a statement of satisfaction with God, right?
Hmm.
That's what you are supposed to remember. So our 10 words takeaway this week is those who forget the God of creation will never rest.
And to restate it positively,
Yeah. our
The-
positive statement.
Those who remember the God of creation will be satisfied.
Yeah. So it's
This
not.
time you hit 10 words on both of them.
No. Well, I knew you were going to say something. So, I knew I wouldn't be satisfied unless I did that.
Yeah, well, if you really wanted it to be satisfying, it should have been 7 words.
Well, there's 7 words. There's 7 words in there. Now, there's certain things like the 10 Commandments that should never be forgotten.
Mhm.
And that's why I think God says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, because he's saying, never forget God, our creator. Never forget God, our savior. Those are things that we should never forget. And we should be satisfied in those things. We should rest in them and say, I have such a great God,
Mhm.
So maybe as you reflect on it, as you're watching, you're wondering, have I done a good job of remembering God? Have I done a good job of remembering his works for me? The way God did in Genesis 2, or the way Christ did at the end of the cross,
Mhm.
and his work there. And maybe you look at your own works and you say, am I satisfied with my own life, what I do with my life each day? Maybe do I need to go back and reevaluate these things, and so that I can be satisfied with God, so that I can see through God's eyes the same satisfaction he has with me as his creature. That's the only way you'll ever be satisfied with yourself, by the way, is if you can learn to see yourself as God sees you, as his creation, that he sits and rests on the 7th day. And
Here's
says,
a good quote I just thought of right now. I think it's Aquinas who says, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in God."
oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard that before, and I just now thought, oh, man, should have had that ready to go.
That's the only satisfaction you're ever
Yeah.
going to find.
I mean,
And that's
basically, like our natural desires, right, are kind of sinful desires to satisfy ourselves with food, wealth, sex, and everything.
Mm-hmm.
You can get those things, and you can chase those things, but you're going to find when you get them that they don't actually fulfill you.
Mm-hmm.
Or you may never get them, and you'll just always be chasing them. And then, like a Buddhist approach would be to say, well, just negate all your desire then. No desire for anything, and then you'll never be disappointed. and then the Christian approach is desire God. And right, like seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you.
Yeah.
Like that's the only way to be satisfied. You could be unsatisfied because you're always chasing the wrong things. You could be unsatisfied because you've glutted yourself with them and they're not fulfilling. You could be unsatisfied because you just don't want anything. Or you can be satisfied in God.
Or that other quote that you say is the person who's lost their desire is worse than the person who's
Yeah,
lost
that's Augustine, I think.
their desire.
The man who is lost in his desires is better off than the man who has lost his desire.
Yeah. And that desire has to be in God. And that's why we're called in this commandment to remember God. Remember the satisfaction of the good things God's prepared for us.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So if you're looking for that in your life, like we always do, we encourage you to find a church body near you, a group that has a good reputation, somebody who's a Christian that you respect, and say, hey, I'd like to come to worship with you, learn more about Christianity. Join a body of believers, of people who have this mindset, who don't forget to remember God, to remember his Sabbath, remember the satisfaction of having a creator God who loves them.
Yeah, you always know when and where you can find them because they'll be at church on Sunday morning.
That's right. That's right. So he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible Discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2025 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.